My mom stole the rent money I'd been saving in a book on my shelf, then showed off a designer bag she got from a friend. When I told her to give it back or leave, she laughed and said, "Sweetheart, you can't evict your own mother." I stayed silent. That was 10 months ago. Yesterday, she was led out of court in handcuffs, screaming my name. My mom has always been the kind of person who treats boundaries like they're optional, especially mine. When I was a kid, it wasn't just about taking my birthday money or borrowing my clothes. She had this habit of inserting herself into every little thing I did, and if she couldn't benefit from it, she'd ruin it. When I was 12, I got into drawing. I saved for months to buy a set of expensive markers. One afternoon, I came home from school and found her using them to make garage sale signs, outside, in the dirt, with no lids on the markers. When I got upset, she said, "Oh, don't be dramatic. It's not like you were using them right now." When I was 15, she made me skip a school trip I'd saved for, claiming she needed help at home. Later, I found out she spent that same weekend at a casino with her friends. If I confronted her about things like that, she'd make me feel crazy. "You're misremembering," or "Wow, you really think I'm a bad mom, don't you?" By the time I was 22, I'd learned the only way to have anything of my own was to move out. I got a small one-bedroom apartment. That lasted exactly 8 months before my mom called me crying. She claimed she was between places because her landlord had screwed her over. She begged me to let her stay just a week until she figured things out. I hesitated, but she pulled the "I'm your mother and you wouldn't be here without me" card. I gave in. The first day, she was charming, brought wine, and cooked dinner. By day 3, she had taken over my bed, leaving me to sleep on the couch because her back hurt. She'd invite her friends over without asking, and one night I came home to find them eating takeout in my living room, drinking my wine, and laughing like they owned the place. She also started snooping. I caught her going through my dresser, looking for laundry detergent. She borrowed my clothes without asking, used my skincare, and even wore my work heels to go out. But the real breaking point came when rent was due. I had $1,350 in an envelope inside a book on my shelf, the same hiding spot I'd been using since I moved in. It wasn't out in the open, but it wasn't Fort Knox either. One morning, I went to grab it before heading to work, and the envelope was gone. My stomach dropped. I turned the apartment upside down, checked the laundry basket, even looked in the fridge. Nothing. When I asked my mom if she'd seen it, she gave me this overly offended look and said, "Do you seriously think I'd take money from my own child?" She followed it with, "You must have misplaced it. You've always been scatterbrained." But here's the thing. Her nails were freshly done, her hair was styled, and there was a designer shopping bag under the kitchen table. I asked about it and she said a friend gave it to her. Sure, I told her straight, "I need that money back or you have to leave." She laughed in my face. "Sweetheart, you can't evict your own mother. That's not how this works." Turns out it was exactly how it worked. The lease was in my name only. I went to my landlord that day, explained she was an unauthorized occupant who had stolen from me, and asked what could be done. He was blunt. "If you want her gone, we can serve her." We didn't just serve her. We made it impossible for her to get back in. The following Monday, while she was out running errands, the landlord had the locks changed. I packed all her things into boxes, left them neatly stacked in the hallway, and taped a copy of the notice to the door. When she came back, she pounded on it so hard my neighbor came out to check. She yelled about how I was a cold, ungrateful daughter and had no idea how family works. I told her through the door, family doesn't steal rent money and lie about it. She stormed off, dragging her boxes and muttering about how I'd regret this when she's gone for good. A week later, I got a text from my aunt saying my mom was telling everyone I'd thrown her onto the street for no reason. I sent my aunt screenshots of the official eviction notice and a photo of the empty book where my rent money had been. My aunt didn't text back. I found that designer bag my mom bought listed on Facebook Marketplace 2 days after the eviction, for way less than she probably paid. Guess she needed the cash more than she needed to keep up appearances. But as I was scrolling, I saw that she was also selling something special to me. It was my father's watch that he gave me before he died. The listing showed a gold and steel Rolex Submariner for $8,500 with the description, "Vintage watch, need cash fast," posted by Diane M. My hand started shaking as I stared at the grainy photo, because I recognized every scratch on that bezel. Dad had pressed that watch into my palm 5 years ago, the week before cancer took him, making me promise to keep it forever. I clicked on the listing and saw she'd already dropped the price twice in the past 3 days. The seller's number was right there, so I dialed it using *67 to block my caller ID. My mother's voice came through clear as day, talking to someone about meeting at a Starbucks on Camelback Road in 2 hours for $7,000 cash. She sounded cheerful, like she was selling old furniture instead of the last thing my dying father gave me. I hung up without saying anything and grabbed my car keys. My hands were still shaking as I texted Nathan, my ex who still checked in sometimes. I typed out everything about the watch and the Starbucks meeting and asked him to come. His reply came back in seconds, telling me not to go alone and that he was already heading over. I got to the Starbucks 40 minutes early and parked where I could see the whole patio. While I waited, I kept touching the small scar on my palm from when Dad taught me to fish at Lake Pleasant. He told me that day the watch would be mine to pass to my own kids someday. Nathan's truck pulled up next to me and he got in my car without saying much. We watched the entrance together until my mother showed up in an Uber carrying a designer purse I'd never seen before. She walked onto the patio scanning for someone and sat at a corner table with her back to us. Nathan and I went inside and grabbed a table where we could see everything. A man in a nice suit showed up right on time and sat across from her. My mother pulled out a blue velvet box and opened it for him. The buyer took out a jeweler's loupe and examined the watch carefully while I recorded everything on my phone. He started counting out $100 bills on the table while my mother laughed that fake laugh she does when she's nervous. She was going on about downsizing her collection like she had a whole drawer of Rolexes at home. The man counted out 70 bills and pushed them across the table. My mother grabbed them and stuffed them into that same designer bag she'd bought with my rent money. The buyer stood up with the watch box and headed for the parking lot. I followed him out and caught up to him at his car. I told him that watch was stolen property and I was the rightful owner. His face went white when I showed him the police report number I'd filed that morning. The man, who said his name was Tom, looked at the watch and then back at me. I showed him photos on my phone of my dad wearing that exact watch at my graduation, at Christmas, at the hospital. Then I showed him the will that specifically named me as the recipient of the watch. Tom said he'd had a feeling something was off because she seemed desperate and didn't know basic stuff about the watch. He agreed to wait for the police and even offered to give his statement about the whole thing. Officer Valdez showed up about 15 minutes later and started taking our statements. My mother came out of the Starbucks and saw the police car and immediately tried to go back inside. Officer Valdez called out for her to stop and she froze on the sidewalk. Her face went through about 5 different expressions before settling on that wounded, innocent look she always used. She walked over clutching her new purse and told the officer this was just a family dispute. She said I was confused and that my father had given her the watch before he died. I pulled out my phone and played the video I'd taken at the hospital 5 years ago. video. Dad's voice came through clear, saying the exact words while holding my hand with the watch between us. He said my name 3 times in that video and told my mother to promise it would go to me. My mother's face went completely pale as Officer Valdez asked her to explain the video. She started opening her purse real slow, pulling out her wallet and checking the bills inside while my mother stood there frozen like she'd been caught with her hand in the cookie jar. The officer counted out loud and held up each 20, writing down the serial numbers in her notebook while checking them against a photo on her phone that showed Tom's handwritten list from when he documented his cash before putting it in my book. My mother's hands started shaking as each bill matched perfectly. Officer Valdez pulled out her handcuffs and told my mother she was under arrest for theft while reading her rights in that flat cop voice they all use. That's when my mother completely lost it and started screaming about how I was an ungrateful bitch who owed her everything for giving up her youth and her body and her dreams to raise me. She actually tried to lunge at me, but Nathan stepped between us just as she was yelling about how I was destroying the family and everyone would hate me for this. The officer grabbed her arm and spun her around, clicking the cuffs on while my mother kept screaming that I'd regret this and that she'd given me life and I had no right to do this to her. 3 hours later, I was sitting in a hard plastic chair at the police station filling out forms about both the watch and the rent money, while a tired-looking detective named Smith explained that the watch theft was clear-cut with the video evidence, but the rent money would be harder to prove without direct footage of her taking it. Her mother really tried to play the victim card after getting caught red-handed selling that watch. The way she switched from fake innocent to full meltdown when the handcuffs came out tells me everything about who she really. Nathan drove me home without saying a word until we got to my apartment parking lot, and I just broke down sobbing about how she'd sold the last piece of my dad I had left. He held me while I cried into his shirt, snot and tears everywhere, not caring that we'd broken up 6 months ago because I couldn't trust anyone after growing up with her constant lying and stealing. The next morning, my phone started going crazy with calls and texts from family members who'd heard about the arrest. Aunt Linda left a voicemail asking how I could have my own mother arrested when she'd called crying from jail. Cousin Jessica had already posted on Instagram about how family drama was the worst, and some people had no loyalty with a broken heart emoji. I sat at my kitchen table eating cereal and blocking 17 different family members' phone numbers one by one, each block feeling like cutting away dead skin from a wound. The apartment felt so quiet without wondering what she'd break or steal next, and for the first time in weeks, I actually slept in my own bed instead of staying up watching the door. 2 days later, the prosecutor's office called to tell me they were charging her with felony theft for the watch, but couldn't pursue the rent money without more evidence. The prosecutor warned me to expect family pressure and gave me a victim's advocate's contact information for support. That same afternoon, Derek from the pawn shop called and told me my mother had been there 3 times this month trying to pawn jewelry that wasn't hers because they all had other people's initials engraved on them. He said he'd turned her away each time and would write a statement for the case if I needed it. I spent the rest of the day scrolling through Facebook Marketplace and found 4 more listings from my mother using the name Diane M, all designer bags and jewelry posted in the last month. I took screenshots of everything and made a folder on my computer labeled evidence, realizing she'd been stealing and selling stuff way longer than just the rent money and the watch. The victim's advocate Carla met me at a coffee shop near my apartment and explained that family theft cases were the hardest because everyone expected you to just forgive and forget. She asked if my mother had tried to contact me yet, and I showed her the 23 calls from the jail number that I hadn't answered. Carla handed me a tissue even though I wasn't crying yet and told me to document everything, every single contact attempt, every message, every threat. A week later, I sat in the courtroom watching my mother walk in, wearing a black dress I'd never seen before, probably borrowed from Aunt who sat right behind the defense table. The judge read the charges and asked for her plea, and my mother stood up straight and said not guilty in this clear, confident voice like she was the victim here. Aunt posted the $5,000 bail within minutes of it being set, and as they walked past me, my mother turned her head just enough to mouth the words, "You'll regret this." Her public defender, this tired-looking guy with coffee stains on his tie, caught up with the prosecutor in the hallway, asking about a plea deal. That night, Frank called me while I was eating leftover pizza and told me he'd heard about everything and wanted me to know my lease was secure no matter what. He mentioned installing new locks, the kind that need a code and a key, and then casually dropped that my mother had shown up at his office last week, claiming she was still a legal tenant. I thanked him and hung up just as Nathan knocked on my door carrying a bag of Chinese takeout from our old favorite place. We sat on my couch eating lo mein and orange chicken without talking about us or what we used to be, just focusing on the case and what might happen next. He set down his chopsticks and said quietly that people like her don't just accept consequences, they escalate. And I knew he was right, but I was too tired to be scared. 3 days after the arraignment, I heard pounding on my door and looked through the peephole to see my cousin Jessica standing there with 2 guys holding cameras and lighting equipment. She announced through the door that she was making a documentary about family estrangement, and this was perfect content for her film school project. I opened the door just to tell her to leave, but she shoved a camera in my face and started asking questions about childhood trauma and forgiveness. I slammed the door hard enough to rattle the frame, but she kept filming through my window until I called building security, who escorted them out. The next morning at work, my boss pulled me into his office and closed the door, telling me someone had called claiming to be a detective investigating me. The caller asked about my mental health history, my work performance, whether I'd ever shown signs of violence or instability, but my boss knew something was off and didn't give any information. He showed me the caller ID on his phone, and it was Aunt's cell number, not even blocked or hidden, just right there, bold as anything. 2 weeks passed with nothing happening, and I started to relax, thinking maybe they'd given up. But then I woke up to my neighbor banging on my door at 6 in the morning. My car was destroyed, all 4 tires slashed deep. The word "ungrateful cunt" keyed into the driver's door in huge, jagged letters. The security guard said the camera footage for that exact hour was corrupted, just static, nothing before or after, just that 1 hour gone. Officer Valdez came out and took photos and measurements, but said without proof connecting it to my mother, there wasn't much they could do. The prosecutor called me that afternoon with an update that made my stomach drop. My mother's lawyer was pushing for dismissal, claiming I'd given her the watch as a gift. They needed more evidence of her pattern of theft, something concrete and documented, and that's when I remembered she'd had access to my grandmother's estate last year. I spent the rest of the day calling lawyers and banks, and finally reached my grandmother's estate attorney, who'd been trying to track down missing jewelry for months. My therapist, who I'd been seeing since Dad died 5 years ago, suggested we make a comprehensive list of everything my mother had taken over the years. We sat in her office for 2 hours as I remembered item after item: birthday money when I was 8, my laptop in college that she sold for drug money, jewelry from ex-boyfriends, even my pain pills after my wisdom teeth surgery. The list filled 3 pages single-spaced, and my therapist said it showed a clear pattern pattern of escalating theft and boundary violations. The estate lawyer called back the next day with news that made everything click into place. About $30,000 worth of jewelry was missing from my grandmother's estate, pieces that were supposed to be distributed to the grandchildren, and my mother was the only one with access to the safe deposit box. He'd been investigating for months but hadn't wanted to accuse anyone without proof, though he had his suspicions all along. That night, I decided to go through everything my mother had given me recently, looking for anything suspicious, and found a small teddy bear she'd brought over last month just because. The bear felt weirdly heavy, and when I squeezed it, I felt something hard inside, so I cut open the back seam carefully. Inside was a tiny camera, the kind you can buy online for $50, with a memory card still recording everything in my bedroom. My skin crawled thinking about her watching me sleep, change clothes, have private moments, and I immediately drove to the police station with the bear in a plastic bag. The desk sergeant took one look at the bear and called the detective who'd been handling my case, and within 20 minutes I was sitting in an interview room while they plugged the memory card into their computer. The footage started playing and my stomach turned as I watched my mother let herself into my apartment with a key I didn't know she had, going straight to my desk and photographing every bank statement, every credit card bill, even my work ID badge. She tried on 3 of my dresses, took selfies in my bathroom mirror, and went through my jewelry box like she was shopping at a store. The worst part came when she made a phone call while sitting on my bed, and the detective turned up the volume so we could hear her telling someone she'd found my savings account info and just needed to figure out the password. The detective paused the video and asked if I recognized the voice on the other end, but it was too muffled to make out clearly. He made copies of everything and said this was enough for additional charges of unlawful surveillance and stalking, which meant they could arrest her again even though she'd already been released on bail for the theft charges. I spent the next 3 hours giving a detailed statement about every time I'd felt watched or noticed things moved in my apartment, and the detective said they'd pick her up within 24 hours. Sure enough, the next morning, Officer Valdez called to say they'd arrested my mother at a motel outside Phoenix where she'd been staying, and this time the judge revoked her bail completely because she was clearly a danger to me. My phone immediately started blowing up with calls from Aunt Linda screaming that I was destroying the family and threatening to sue me for emotional distress, but I just blocked her number and called Nathan to ask if he could help me change my locks. He came over that afternoon with a whole toolkit and new deadbolts, and while we worked on the door, he mentioned he'd been worried about me ever since we broke up. As he installed a chain lock, he said something that caught me off guard about how he didn't actually leave because of my trust issues, but because he couldn't handle always feeling like my mother was there between us, even when she wasn't physically present. Nathan installing those locks while dropping truth bombs hits different. Nothing says I still care, quite like bringing power tools and calling out the real reason you left while fixing security problems. We spent the rest of the day installing a security system with cameras at every entrance, and he stayed for dinner to help me test everything was working right. Even with my mother locked up and new security everywhere, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, and every little noise in the apartment made me jump like something bad was about to happen. I started sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed and checking the locks 3 or 4 times before going to sleep, and I'd wake up in the middle of the night sure I heard someone trying the door handle. 2 weeks later, my cousin Jessica posted a TikTok with the title, "My cousin had her own mother arrested story time," and within 6 hours it had over 1 million views and thousands of comments calling me every name you could think of. Someone in the comments posted my actual address before TikTok deleted it, but not before I started getting food deliveries I didn't order, and people calling my phone number at all hours leaving death threats on my voicemail. The next Monday, HR called me into their office to say they'd been getting anonymous complaints about my unstable behavior and family criminal connections, and while they were supportive of my situation, they suggested I work from home until things calmed down for everyone's safety. I agreed because honestly I was scared to leave my apartment anyway, and at least working from home meant I could keep all the doors locked and monitor the security cameras while I worked. About 6 weeks after the initial arrest, I had to go to the grocery store for food, and while I was sitting in my car in the parking lot, I saw a woman with the same hair and walk as my mother and completely lost it. I couldn't breathe, my chest felt like it was crushing in, and I must have sat there for over an hour having a full panic attack until Nathan found me after I texted him something that didn't make sense. He kept reminding me she was in jail and couldn't hurt me, but we both knew that wasn't really true because the damage was already done, and I was scared of my own shadow. 3 days later, the prosecutor called with news that made my blood run cold, saying my mother had made bail through a bondsman that Aunt Linda hired, and she was out with just a restraining order to stay 500 feet away from me. The prosecutor warned me that restraining orders were just pieces of paper and couldn't actually stop someone determined to cause problems, so I needed to be extra careful and report any violations immediately. That same afternoon, Derek from the pawn shop called to tell me my mother had come in with a sob story about needing money for a lawyer, and when he refused to buy anything from her, she'd said I'd be sorry for turning the family against her. He had it all on security footage and offered to send it to the police, which I immediately accepted because I needed every bit of evidence I could get to protect myself. I was too scared to leave the apartment after that, peeking through the peephole every time someone delivered food or packages, and Nathan started staying over on my couch because we both knew I shouldn't be alone, even if we didn't talk about what it meant for us. 2 months crawled by with Nathan sleeping on my couch every night and me jumping at every noise outside my door. The pre-trial hearing finally came, and I sat in that courtroom watching my mother's new lawyer, some guy in an expensive suit that Aunt must have emptied her retirement savings to pay for, stand up and tell the judge this was all just a family miscommunication. He actually said those words while my mother sat there in a conservative dress I'd never seen her wear, looking like someone's sweet grandmother instead of the woman who'd stolen my rent money and my dead father's watch. The judge spent 20 minutes looking through all the evidence, the police reports, the pawn shop records, the security footage from my building, and then denied the motion without even blinking. He set the trial date for 3 months out, and I thought maybe I could breathe again. I was walking to my car in the parking garage when footsteps echoed behind me, and there she was, my mother, coming straight at me even though the restraining order said she had to stay 500 feet away. She got close enough that I could smell her perfume before she hissed that I was always my father's daughter, weak and sentimental and stupid, and that he died to get away from us both. Security came running when I screamed, but she was already walking away, calm as anything. 3 days later, my grandmother's estate lawyer called and said he'd found something during his investigation. My mother had withdrawn $32,000 worth of jewelry from my grandmother's safety deposit box using forged signatures 6 months before she died. He was adding criminal charges and civil suits to everything else because this was grand larceny now. Nathan came over that night and we finally had the conversation we'd been avoiding for weeks. He sat on my couch and told me he couldn't be my protector forever, but he also couldn't walk away knowing she was out there. We decided to try again, slowly, with therapy, because we both knew we needed help after everything. The next morning, I found out my mother had created a Facebook page called Falsely Accused Mothers, where she was posting edited screenshots of our text text conversations that made me look completely unstable. Hundreds of strangers were commenting about ungrateful millennials and elder abuse, and how kids these days don't respect their parents. The victim's advocate assigned to my case, this woman named Carla, who'd seen everything in her 20 years doing this job, helped me file cyberstalking charges that afternoon. She told me to document everything, every post, every comment, every fake account my mother created, because she was building a harassment case against herself. 3 months after the initial arrest, I finally went back to the office part-time because I needed the money and some kind of normal routine. My coworkers treated me like I was made of glass, being super supportive but careful, like I might shatter if they said the wrong thing. My boss gave me remote-friendly projects and told me I could leave suddenly if I needed to, which was good because 2 weeks later, Aunt showed up at my work with what she called a peace offering. She had this box that she claimed my mother wanted me to have, full of my childhood photos, except when security escorted her out and I opened it, every single picture had my face scratched out with betrayer written across them in red marker. The next day, my mother's criminal lawyer contacted me directly even though he wasn't supposed to, suggesting we could work this out in family counseling instead of court. When I said no, he started hinting that my mental health history from when I was a teenager might become relevant at trial, which was a threat if I'd ever heard one. I forwarded everything to the prosecutor, who said this was witness intimidation, and added it to the growing list of charges. I started planning escape routes everywhere I went after that, memorizing exits at the grocery store, keeping my keys between my fingers in parking lots, checking my rearview mirror constantly. Nathan noticed when I mapped out 3 different ways to leave a restaurant before we even sat down, and he gently suggested we should both start therapy together because she'd made us both paranoid, and we couldn't let her win like that. 3 weeks into therapy, Jessica posted an Instagram live while having lunch with my mother and aunt at some cafe downtown. She was showing off her new nails when she flipped the camera around to catch them talking at the table behind her. My mother was leaning close to aunt, saying something about needing me to have just one good breakdown on the stand, how that's all it would take to make the jury doubt everything I said. Jessica didn't even notice what she was recording, too busy talking about nail art, but I was watching from my couch and hit the screen record button immediately. The video stayed up for maybe 2 minutes before Jessica deleted it, probably when she realized she'd caught their conversation, but I had it saved. I sent it to the prosecutor that same afternoon and watched him replay it 3 times in his office, shaking his head each time my mother said the word breakdown. 2 days later, the judge added witness tampering charges to the case and raised my mother's bail by another $20,000. Aunt took out a second mortgage on her house to pay it, according to what Jessica posted on Facebook before deleting that too. The prosecutor started calling it a pattern of intimidation and said we needed to document everything, every text, every social media post, every attempt at contact. I started going to a support group at the community center on Tuesday nights, sitting in a circle with 8 other people whose parents had stolen from them or hurt them in ways that made regular people uncomfortable. One woman talked about how her mother opened 17 credit cards in her name starting when she was 16, ruined her credit so bad she couldn't even get a checking account until she was 30. Another guy's dad sold his car while he was deployed in Afghanistan and kept telling everyone his son gave him permission. Hearing their stories made my chest feel less tight, made me realize I wasn't crazy for pressing charges against my own mother. Nathan's ex-girlfriend Olivia texted me screenshots one Thursday morning that made my hands shake so bad I dropped my phone. My mother had messaged her on Facebook offering $500 for any dirt she had on me, anything that could make me look unstable or vindictive. When Olivia told her to leave her alone, my mother threatened to tell Olivia's new boyfriend about the abortion she'd had in college, information she could only have gotten from going through my old emails. Jessica posting that TikTok makes me wonder if she knew exactly what she was doing when she accidentally recorded them plotting at the cafe. Family drama gets views and she seems pretty aware of social media tactics. We printed everything and added it to the harassment file that was getting thicker every week. Frank came to the courthouse for his deposition wearing his only suit, the one he wore to collect rent on the 1st of every month. He sat across from my mother's lawyer and explained in his steady voice how she'd called him repeatedly trying to convince him I was mentally ill and needed to be evicted for my own safety. He pulled out his phone and showed them the 23 missed calls from her number, the voicemails where she claimed I was a danger to myself and others. The lawyer tried to make it seem like a concerned mother's actions, but Frank just looked at him and said she'd offered him $2,000 to lie about my mental state. 5 months after her arrest, jury selection finally started on a rainy Monday morning. My mother showed up looking like someone's sweet grandmother, wearing a cardigan I'd never seen before, her hair in a soft bun, no makeup except some pale lipstick. The prosecutor pulled me aside and warned me this was all calculated, that she was playing a character for the jury pool. During voir dire, she started crying loudly when the judge asked if anyone knew the defendant, sobbing about losing her only child to mental illness, making sure every potential juror heard her performance. The judge threatened her with contempt charges, and her lawyer grabbed her arm to make her stop. Several people had to be dismissed after admitting they'd seen Jessica's posts about the case on social media, including one woman who said she'd already decided my mother was guilty based on the Instagram live video that had been reshared hundreds of times. The night before opening statements, I couldn't sleep, and Nathan found me in our bedroom closet at 3 in the morning, reorganizing everything by color, then by season, then by color again. I told him how she used to do this when I was a kid, move all my things around so I'd feel crazy and disoriented, so I'd doubt my own memory about where I'd put things. He sat on the floor with me and helped me put everything back randomly, mixing winter coats with summer dresses, work clothes with pajamas, taking back the chaos as something I chose instead of something done to me. Opening statements started at 9 sharp with the prosecutor laying out a pattern of theft and manipulation going back years, showing the jury a timeline of every documented incident, every police report, every piece of evidence we'd collected. My mother's lawyer painted a different picture, claiming I was a vindictive daughter punishing my mother for being a strict parent, for using tough love when I was growing up. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue even though I could see they were completely dry from where I sat. Tom, the guy who bought my father's watch from the pawn shop, took the stand after lunch and pulled out his phone to play the recording he'd made of the transaction. My mother's voice filled the courtroom claiming she'd inherited the watch from her late husband who had just passed away, even though my father had been dead for 5 years. The jury members were taking notes while my mother shifted in her seat, pulling at the cardigan like it was too tight around her neck. The prosecutor called me to the stand next, and my legs felt like jelly walking up there. I placed my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth while avoiding my mother's stare from across the room. The prosecutor started gentle, asking about my childhood, and I told them about the piggy bank I'd saved quarters in when I was 7. My mother had smashed it with a hammer one morning while I was at school, and used the money for scratch-off tickets. Then came the birthday money from grandma when I was 10 that disappeared from my dresser. The Christmas cash from dad's parents at 12 that she claimed I must have lost. The defense attorney attorney jumped up and started attacking me hard, pulling out therapy records from after my dad died. He suggested I had false memories and kept pushing about my mental state after losing my father. I gripped the wooden rail and remembered what the prosecutor had coached me about staying calm and sticking to facts. The judge had to call for order twice when the defense attorney got too aggressive with his questions. Then the prosecutor pulled up a video on the courtroom screen, my dad sitting in his hospital bed 5 years ago. His voice filled the room as he held up his Rolex Submariner and said he wanted me to have it when he was gone. My mother shifted in her seat, and when the camera zoomed on the watch face, she muttered something under her breath. The jury heard it though, because several heads turned toward her, and the court reporter asked her to repeat what she said. Her lawyer grabbed her arm and whispered something fierce while calling for a recess, but the damage was done. During the break, I sat in the witness room drinking water with shaking hands, while the prosecutor told me I did great. When court resumed, Derek from the pawn shop took the stand with a thick folder of paperwork. He testified about my mother coming to his shop at least 6 times over the past 3 years trying to sell things. He pulled out security footage from 2 days after my grandmother's funeral showing my mother trying to pawn grandma's wedding ring. The timestamp showed 9:47 a.m. when the funeral had ended at 8:30 that same morning. Several jury members looked sick watching her haggle over the price of a ring that had been on my grandmother's finger for 60 years. Derek also had records of her trying to sell my dad's golf clubs, a pearl necklace that belonged to my great aunt, and even my high school class ring she'd stolen from my jewelry box. The judge called for lunch break, and I headed to the courthouse bathroom needing a moment alone. I locked myself in a stall and tried to calm my breathing when I heard my mother's voice in the hallway outside. She was talking to someone, probably one of her friends who'd shown up for support, using that sweet fake voice she put on for strangers. She was saying how troubled I'd always been, and how she just prayed I'd get the help I needed. My hands shook with rage as I listened to her spin her lies to whoever would listen. I stayed in that stall until I heard her voice fade down the hallway before finally coming out. Day 3 of the trial started with the prosecutor playing the hidden camera footage I'd set up in my apartment. The courtroom went dead silent as they watched my mother rifle through my underwear drawer, pulling out bras and examining them. She opened my jewelry box and held earrings up to the light, then moved to my closet and started smelling my perfumes. One juror actually turned green when my mother sprayed my most expensive perfume on herself and did a little spin in the mirror. The judge had to call a recess when another juror asked to be excused because she felt sick. Nathan took the stand after the break and testified about the Facebook Marketplace sting we'd set up. The defense attorney tried hard to make it seem like Nathan was just trying to win me back after our breakup, but Nathan stayed calm and pulled out his phone to show the screenshots and timestamps he'd saved from that day. He had photos of my mother showing up with the watch, texts between us planning the meeting, and even a recording of her lying about how she got it. His testimony was solid, and the defense couldn't shake him no matter how hard they tried to paint him as bitter. Then came the moment that changed everything when Aunt Linda took the stand as a defense witness. She started out defending my mother, talking about how hard it had been for her sister after my dad died. But when the prosecutor started asking about money, Linda's face crumbled and she started crying hard. She admitted my mother had convinced her to take out a second mortgage on her house 6 months ago. My mother had said it was for lawyer fees to fight the charges, but Linda had seen her last week wearing a diamond tennis bracelet. The prosecutor pulled out bank records showing my mother had taken over $100,000 from family members over the past decade. There were loans from cousins, money from elderly aunts, even cash from her own mother before she died. The pattern was clear, with every single person getting a sob story about medical bills or car repairs or emergency expenses. Even my mother's lawyer looked uncomfortable as the prosecutor laid out transaction after transaction on the courtroom screen. Against her lawyer's strong advice, my mother demanded to take the stand on day 4. She walked up there in a black dress looking like she was going to a funeral and immediately started her victim act. She claimed I'd been disturbed since my father died and that she was just trying to protect family heirlooms from my instability. She said I'd been violent and aggressive, that I'd threatened her, that she feared for her safety around me. The prosecutor let her talk for 20 minutes, giving her enough rope to hang herself with lie after lie. Then came the cross-examination, and my mother's story started falling apart like wet tissue paper. She couldn't explain why the hidden camera showed her stealing if she was just protecting things. She couldn't explain the forged signatures on the pawn shop paperwork if the items were really hers. When asked why she listed my father's watch as vintage instead of using his name, she stammered and changed her story 3 times. The prosecutor showed her the video of my father again and asked her directly if she heard him leave the watch to me. Her face went red and she started yelling that she deserved that money because she wasted her life raising me. The entire courtroom went silent as her mask finally dropped completely, and everyone saw who she really was. The judge had to bang his gavel 3 times before the courtroom settled down again. 2 days later, I was back in the same building waiting for the jury to decide. Tom coming through with actual recordings while mom's pulling the grieving widow card 5 years late is peak irony. Guess she forgot about those pesky timestamps when planning her sob story. Nathan sat next to me in a quiet corner while other cases moved through the halls around us. He squeezed my hand and told me that standing up to her was already a victory no matter what happened. I realized I hadn't even thought about checking my apartment locks in 3 days. My cousin Jessica found us in the hallway during a break and came over looking nervous. She said she was sorry and that she hadn't known how bad things really were. Her mom had lost everything because of mine and she'd blamed me for it. She pulled out her phone right there and started deleting all the social media posts she'd made about me. She even offered to testify if there was going to be a civil trial later. The bailiff called us back after just 2 hours of jury deliberation. My stomach dropped because quick verdicts usually meant one thing or the other with no middle ground. My mother sat at the defense table reapplying her lipstick like she was about to give some kind of acceptance speech. The prosecutor reached over and squeezed my shoulder as the jury filed back in. The foreman stood up with the paper in his hand and read guilty on all counts. The words just hung there in the air while my mother's face went from smug to completely shocked. She jumped up and started shouting that it was all a mistake and they were believing a mentally ill child over her mother. The judge banged his gavel and scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks out. Because of her outburst, he revoked her bail right there on the spot. As the court officers moved toward her, she turned to look at me with pure hatred in her eyes. She said I was dead to her, and when she got out, I'd have no family left. They cuffed her and led her away, still yelling about how this was all wrong. In the parking lot, I finally broke down and cried for the mother I never had and never would have. Nathan held me while I let go of the fantasy that she might change someday, or that we could have a real relationship. He told me it was okay to grieve even if she never deserved me in the first place. 2 weeks after the verdict, the extended family completely split down the middle. Some of them supported me after seeing all the evidence, but others said I should have handled it privately. I changed my phone number and only gave it to the people who had actually shown up to court. I started going through my apartment and removing anything she had ever touched or given me. Each item I put in the donation box felt like I was getting rid of a ghost. The teddy bear with the hidden camera went straight to the police as evidence for the civil suit. My grandmother's estate lawyer called with news that they were recovering the stolen jewelry. She had put it in a safety deposit box under a fake name, but they'd tracked it down. My portion of the inheritance would finally be distributed after all these years. It wouldn't replace what she took from me emotionally, but at least it was some kind of justice. While going through my dad's old emails for the civil case, I found messages he'd sent to his lawyer. One from just 3 months before he died talked about filing for divorce from my mother. He wrote that she was stealing from my college fund and he couldn't protect me if he stayed married to her. The lawyer had drafted the papers, but my dad died before he could file them. I sat there staring at the screen for what felt like hours before closing the laptop. 3 weeks later, the victim's advocate met me at the prosecutor's office with a yellow legal pad and a box of tissues. She had kind eyes and kept pushing water bottles across the table while I tried to find words for what my mother had taken from me. Every sentence I wrote felt like ripping off a bandage, but she kept nodding and telling me to keep going. I wrote about the birthday money and the markers and the watch and how I couldn't sleep without checking my door was locked 3 times. I wrote about jumping when anyone knocked and hiding my wallet under my pillow and how I'd started keeping receipts for everything because I was scared no one would believe me. Nathan texted while I was writing to ask if I wanted dinner at our old Thai place on Camelback Road. We'd been talking more since the trial started, and he'd been coming to therapy sessions with me twice a week. That night over pad thai, he reached across the table and took my hand. We didn't need to say much because we both knew we were trying again, but with new rules this time. 6 weeks crawled by before sentencing day arrived and I threw up twice that morning. The courtroom was packed and my mother shuffled in wearing orange with her hands cuffed in front of her. Her hair was flat against her head and her nails were bare, and she looked smaller than I remembered. When the judge asked if she wanted to make a statement, she stood up and started talking about how everyone had failed her. She blamed her parents for not loving her enough and my dad for dying and leaving her alone and the system for not understanding mental illness. She saved the worst for me, saying I'd always been jealous of her and wanted to destroy her life because I couldn't handle her being happy. The prosecutor squeezed my shoulder when it was my turn to stand. My hands shook holding the papers, but my voice came out steady as I read every word I'd written with the advocate. I told the judge she hadn't just stolen money but had stolen my sense of safety and my ability to trust anyone, including myself. I said she'd made me doubt my own memories and question if I was a good person for wanting her to face consequences. The last line was the hardest, but I looked right at her when I said it. The judge took a long breath before speaking and the whole room went silent. He called her actions a severe breach of trust and said the evidence showed a pattern of manipulation and theft spanning years. Then he said 5 years with possibility of parole in 3 plus full restitution of all stolen funds. My mother screamed like someone had stabbed her and fell backward into her chair, sobbing that I'd killed her and she'd never survive prison. Aunt Linda ran out of the courtroom crying while my cousin stayed frozen in her seat. The bailiffs had to basically carry my mother out because she went completely limp and wouldn't walk. Her lawyer muttered something about an appeal, but the prosecutor said not to worry because the evidence was rock solid. Outside the courthouse, the sun was too bright and everything felt unreal, like I was watching someone else's life on TV. Nathan drove while I stared at the palm trees going by and tried to figure out why I felt so empty instead of happy. The prosecutor's assistant called a week later to say the civil suit paperwork was ready, and with the criminal conviction, it should be straightforward. My lawyer said I could probably get around $40,000 between what she stole and damages, which would be enough to start over somewhere new. The next Saturday, I drove to the cemetery with Dad's watch on my wrist and a 6-pack of his favorite beer. I sat by his headstone for the first time since all this started and told him everything that had happened. I told him about getting the watch back and finally standing up to her, and how I wished he'd been there to see it. The beer got warm in the sun, but I stayed until the cemetery was closing, and the groundskeeper started giving me looks. Frank called Monday morning asking if I could stop by the office because he had something to discuss. When I got there, he slid a paper across his desk that said he'd release me from my lease with no penalty if I wanted a fresh start somewhere else. Nathan was waiting in his truck when I came out, and we drove around looking at apartments in Scottsdale where nobody would know our story or ask questions about what happened. We found a place that same afternoon and signed the lease before anyone could change their mind about renting to us. The next week, I went back to my old apartment to pack everything up and kept finding pieces of her everywhere like she'd marked her territory. Her favorite coffee mug was still in the sink, and there was a grocery list on the fridge in her handwriting with items she'd never get to buy. I threw the mug in the trash so hard it shattered and tossed the list after it, along with a hair tie she'd left on the bathroom counter and the wine stain on the carpet from that first night she'd seemed so grateful to have somewhere to stay. Every trace of her went into garbage bags, but the memories stuck around like smoke damage you can't quite scrub out. My phone buzzed while I was taping boxes, and it was Jessica texting me for the first time since the trial, saying she wanted to apologize properly and had an idea about doing a documentary on family financial abuse. She said it wasn't for content but for awareness, and wanted to interview me and other people who'd been through similar stuff. I told her I'd think about it, but honestly wasn't ready to trust any of them yet. 3 days later, my aunt called from a blocked number crying so hard I could barely understand her at first. She'd lost her house because of the second mortgage my mom had talked her into, and was staying with friends until she figured out what to do next. She kept saying she was sorry she hadn't believed me sooner, and that my mother had destroyed them both financially. We made plans to maybe get coffee once she got back on her feet, but I wasn't holding my breath. The recovery check from the federal case showed up 2 weeks later for $42,000 after the lawyers took their cut. I went straight to the bank and put Dad's watch in a safety deposit box where nobody could ever touch it again, then used $5,000 for a security system at our new place with cameras and smart locks that alert my phone if anyone tries to get in. The rest went into an account at a different bank under just my name that my mother would never know existed, even if she somehow got out early. Why did the judge only give her 5 years when she stole for decades and destroyed multiple lives? The way she played victim right to the end while her sister lost her house makes me wonder if she actually believes her own lies at this point. 3 months passed, and I realized one morning that I hadn't checked the locks before bed in over a week. Nathan noticed it too and said I was healing while we unpacked the last boxes in our new place that had never been touched by her chaos. My boss called me into his office the next Monday and promoted me to senior marketing manager, saying the whole situation had made the news and cleared my reputation completely. Plus, I'd been doing great work despite everything. It was the exact job my mother always said I wasn't smart enough to get whenever I talked about my career goals. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in family trauma and spent sessions processing the grief of accepting she'd never be the mother I needed. The therapist pointed out that I'd basically parented myself my whole life, and now I could choose my own family instead of being stuck with the one I was born into. I thought about Nathan, who'd come back when I needed him, and Frank, who'd helped me more than my own relatives, and even Jessica trying to make things right in her own way. 6 months went by without any flying monkeys showing up at my door, or harassment from her friends, or even having to look over my shoulder in parking lots. I joined a boxing gym near our apartment and started going 3 times a week to hit heavy bags until my arms burned and my mind went quiet. The instructor said I hit like someone with something to prove, and I didn't tell him he was right. Father's Day came around and I wore Dad's watch for the first time since getting it back from evidence. Nathan took a photo of me holding my wrist up next to the picture of Dad. I keep on my dresser with the sunlight catching the gold face just right. He said Dad had protected me the only way he could by making sure I'd have evidence when I needed it most. A letter arrived the next week with her prison return address, and I recognized her handwriting immediately. Without opening it, I wrote return to sender in big letters across the front and dropped it back in the mailbox on my way to work. Walking back to our apartment that evening, I saw Nathan through the window making dinner and singing along to whatever was playing on his phone. I stood there for a minute just watching him move around our kitchen that she'd never been in and would never be allowed to enter. This was what safety felt like after 28 years of not knowing if I'd ever have it. Choosing who gets to stay in your life and who doesn't get a second chance to destroy what you've built. Time flies when you're not busy checking locks every 5 seconds, and that promotion hitting right after Mom said you'd never be smart enough? Chef's kiss, like the video. It helps more than you think.